March 14, 1944, 20,000 feet above Bremen, the German pilot from Munich flying his Fokker-Wulf 190 watched the American fighters below and felt a familiar surge of confidence rising inside him as he studied their shapes through the glare of the sun. The Hellcats looked bulky and slow to his eyes like metal barrels with wings. He had listened to other Luftwaffe pilots mock them in the mess hall, calling them flying trucks and ironworks specials built by a company that valued durability more than finesse. He believed every word. He had 17 victory marks on his rudder, most of them bombers, but a few were fighters that had tried and failed to outfly him, including Thunderbolts and a Mustang. This would be his first Hellcat, and he intended to make it a clean kill. He rolled his fighter inverted and began a controlled dive from the sun. The American pilots had not spotted him yet, and that suited him well. At 600 yards, still far for a perfect shot, he watched the Hellcats hold their weaving formation above the bomber stream. Their shapes offended everything he believed about fighter design. Thick bodies, broad wings, giant radial engines. It looked as if someone had kept adding metal until the thing could barely lift itself. His German machine was 2,000 pounds lighter faster in a dive, quicker in a roll. He trusted physics. He trusted his experience. He trusted his instincts. But Lieutenant Jim Patterson from Des Moines, Iowa, saw the threat first. He had been flying F6F-5 Hellcats for 8 months and had spent most of that time fighting Japanese Zeros in the Pacific before being transferred to Europe, where the Navy had loaned squadrons to the Army Air Forces for bomber escort missions. He checked his armament panel out of habit and confirmed that all 6 50 caliber guns were loaded with the new rounds, the armor-piercing incendiary ammunition the ordnance crews called API. The first time he had witnessed their power had been during a ground demonstration when they fired into a derelict German truck. The metal had looked like someone had cut into it with a blowtorch and smashed it with a hammer at the same time. He remembered the fire, the splintered steel, the glowing fragments. Now those same rounds were in his guns. He called out band 2 o'clock high coming down. The Hellcat formation reacted instantly, not with fear but disciplined precision honed by months of combat. They banked to meet the threat. The German pilot kept descending confident in the advantage of surprise. At 400 yards, he squeezed off a burst from his wing-root cannons, sending 2 20mm shells toward Patterson. Patterson pulled hard and felt 7 GS press against his body. The Hellcat creaked, but held together like a fist. The shells streaked past below him, the closest ripping the air with a sound he felt more than heard. Now it was his turn. The German tried to pull away using the speed of his lighter fighter to create distance, but Patterson had learned to read energy lines while fighting Zeros near rabble, and to him, the 190 felt slow, almost lazy. He led the target by instinct, placing his guns not where the German was, but where he would be in 2 seconds. He squeezed the trigger. 6 Browning 50 caliber guns roared at once. Each spewed 800 rounds per minute, and each API bull, it carried a hardened metal core surrounded by incendiary material that ignited on impact, releasing heat near 3,000 degrees before the core punched onward. The tracers glowed faintly, marking the stream. The German saw them coming and rolled sharply left. Most of the burst missed, but not all. 3 rounds struck home. The first slammed into the right wing group. The incendiary compound flashed white-hot, burning through the aluminum like paper, while the penetrator core cut a hydraulic line. The second hit the engine cowling and showered burning particles into the engine compartment. The third punched through the cockpit armor just inches from the pilot, who felt its heat and heard the impact like a hammer hitting steel. His fighter shook violently. Warning lights flared, hydraulic pressure plummeted, oil temperature spiked, smoke curled beneath the cowling and drifted into the cockpit. He had been hit before, but never like this. These bullets had exploded. They had carved his fighter apart with barely 3 strikes. He rolled, inverted, and dove in desperation. But the Hellcat followed close behind, gathering speed with the weight of 18,000 pounds. Pulled by a roaring Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine at war emergency power, delivering 2,800 horsepower like a falling hammer. The German pilot faced a choice. His base lay 40 miles away. His engine was overheating rapidly. The controls had grown heavy and slow without hydraulic assist. He could try to limp home or bail out over enemy territory. Pride told him to fight. Survival whispered otherwise. At 10,000 feet, with the engine beginning to seize Survival 1, he jettisoned the canopy and threw himself into the icy air. Patterson watched his chute open, a white flower blooming below. He circled once to mark the position for recovery, then climbed to rejoin his squadron. The entire fight had lasted little more than 90 seconds. Within days, the story of explosive American bullets spread through the Luftwaffe. Pilots whispered about ammunition that burned through metal, that detonated on impact, that turned small hits into fatal wounds. Fear crept into ready rooms from Norway to Italy. Those flying trucks the Americans brought could spit out 4,800 explosive rounds per minute. That was a calculation no German pilot wanted to face at 20,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison from San Diego had spent years flying fighters across 2 oceans, and he believed the Helk. That was the most honest machine he had ever flown, because it never fooled a pilot, never hid its strengths, and never pretended to be graceful. It was a brute built for war, and he trusted it completely, especially now that every gun carried armor-piercing incendiary rounds. He had loaded 1,800 rounds for this mission, 300 in each gun, enough for 18 seconds of continuous fire, though he never planned to hold the trigger that long because a 1-second burst was usually all he needed. When Captain Hans Müller from Stuttgart led his staffel of 8 Focke-Wulf 190s toward a bomber stream on March 22, 1944, he expected an easy interception because he had 31 victories, and he believed no American fighter could challenge him. He had heard of the loaned Navy Hellcat units, but he assumed they were slow, easy targets. When the first merge happened at 18,000 feet over Hanover, he picked the lead Hellcat, which carried a red cowling with the number 13 on its side, and he smiled at the supposed bad luck number. He dove at a 60-degree angle, confident in his speed advantage, but Morrison broke into the attack with a turn so hard that Müller felt genuine surprise for the first time that day. The Hellcat completed a 9G turn without losing its wings and without stalling, and before Müller could reset his firing angle, Morrison pulled lead and squeezed off a short burst. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into the tail of the German fighter, first tearing away the elevator with 3 violent impacts. Then the rounds marched toward the fuselage fuel tank, where 5 of them detonated at once, igniting the aviation fuel into a roaring sheet of fire. More rounds tore into the engine in less than a second, shattering cylinders, bending the crankshaft, and turning the tight engineering into twisted debris before Müller even realized what had happened. His fighter disintegrated almost instantly. The tail separated, then the wings folded as the weakened spars snapped, then the engine burst outward in fragments. One round even penetrated the armored headrest and detonated, killing Müller instantly. His wreckage fell 5,000 feet in seconds, trailing black smoke. The remaining Luftwaffe pilots scattered in panic as the Hellcats pressed their advantage. The German pilots had always relied on their superior speed to dive away from trouble, but the Hellcats followed them down, easily gaining speed like a hammer falling, and when they fired, each hit erupted in a flash. One surviving pilot, Lieutenant Wolfgang Becker from Berlin, barely escaped, but his Focke-Wulf tail section was punched open by 2 armor-piercing incendiary rounds that left holes large enough to fit his fist through. Hydraulic lines were shredded, and his engine sputtered as he limped home, landing gear up in a field 20 miles from his base. When mechanics examined the aircraft, they found 17 fragment holes created by only 2 bullet impacts, each hole surrounded by burn marks and peeled metal. The intelligence officer listening to Becker's account found it hard to believe, but the evidence sat in front of him. The Americans were firing what looked like miniature grenades from 50 caliber guns. The impact burns the internal damage, the blown-apart structures. Everything pointed to a new kind of ammunition. Within 2 weeks, the Luftwaffe changed its tactics. No more aggressive pushing into bomber formations when Hellcats were present. No more sustained engagements where German fighters tried to outmuscle American escorts. The old belief in superior quality and skill started to fade because skill meant nothing when explosive rounds tore a fighter apart with a handful of hits. Meanwhile, Sergeant Tony Russo from Pittsburgh, who had been loading armor-piercing incendiary ammunition since February, already understood the devastation they caused. He had loaded the same rounds in the Pacific where Zeros disintegrated under even modest bursts. The lightweight Japanese fighters had no armor at all, and Russo had seen gun camera footage where a Zero took 5 hits and vanished in a fireball. He knew German fighters were stronger, but even they could not withstand dozens of exploding rounds. That truth became painfully clear on April 8, 1944, during the massive air battle over Brunswick, when 312 bombers headed toward aircraft factories, escorted by Mustang's Thunderbolts and 2 squadrons of Navy Hellcats. The Luftwaffe scrambled 160 fighters, including Focke-Wulf, 190s Bf-109s and several Me-410 heavy fighters, and planned to punch straight through to the bombers by absorbing expected losses to the escorting fighters. But the Hellcats had been given new orders. They were to sweep ahead and break up German attacks before they formed. Lieutenant Carl Dixon from Topeka led 8 Hellcats forward, and they found more than 30 German fighters gathering at 15,000 feet. The Germans saw them and assumed 8 stubby American fighters were no threat. Major Fritz Beckmann reportedly laughed over the radio, thinking the Americans foolish for sending so few. The Hellcats dove from 20,000 feet, exceeding 400 miles per hour, and Dixon targeted a Bf-109 in the lead element, firing from 600 yards. It was long range, but his armor-piercing incendiary rounds made every hit deadly. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber from Dresden saw the tracers and tried to evade, but 4 rounds struck just behind his cockpit, blowing open plate-sized holes that shredded control cables, ruptured fuel lines, and sent burning magnesium fragments deep into the fuselage. Weber had no control left. He bailed out as his ruined fighter entered a flat spin trailing smoke. Before that day, Weber had survived dozens of battles, and his fighter had taken hundreds of conventional 50 caliber hits without catastrophic failure. Now 4 explosive bullets had destroyed it completely. The rest of the German formation fell into chaos as Hellcats tore through them. The bright flashes showed every impact like camera bulbs firing in the sky. Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston, watching from his B-17 waist gun, saw Focke-Wulf take a long burst, maybe 20 hits, and the fighter simply came apart, wings, snapping tail, breaking engine bursting. To him, it looked like someone had sliced the aircraft along invisible lines using a torch. The combination of the Hellcat's toughness and its explosive ammunition created a nightmare for any foe. Pilots could fire longer, attack more aggressively, and trust their machines to endure hits that would doom other fighters. Lieutenant Jim Thompson from Duluth proved that point 15 minutes into the Brunswick fight, when a Bf-109 fired cannon shells into his tail and rear fuselage. The Hellcat shuddered but survived. Thompson rolled, bringing his guns onto the attacker, and his armor-piercing incendiary rounds turned the German cockpit into a furnace, shattering canopy, glass, blasting through instruments, and sending burning fragments through the pilot's body. The German died screaming as his aircraft spun earthward. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost 43 fighters, with 27 more too damaged to repair. The Hellcats lost only 2, and 1 pilot survived. The statistics spoke for themselves. Conventional ammunition once required 360 rounds to down a fighter. With armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, fewer than 40 rounds were enough. A 2-second burst delivered 20 lethal impacts, enough to tear any enemy machine apart. Major Wilhelm Steinberg of JG-4 wrote that night that skill no longer mattered. The Americans had found a way to make every farm boy a deadly marksman. In the weeks ahead, more pilots would learn that truth the hard way. Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston had seen aerial battles before, but nothing prepared him for what he witnessed during the Brunswick mission, as Hellcats armed with armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through German formations with a level of destruction he had never imagined possible. From his waist gun position inside the B-17, he watched a Focke-Wulf 190 absorb a series of impacts, maybe 20 hits, and each impact flashed bright white, as if miniature suns had ignited across the fighter's skin. The German aircraft disintegrated almost instantly. The wings snapped away, the tail broke free, the engine burst forward in a smoky explosion. And it looked to O'Brien like someone had run a cutting torch through every vital seam at once. The sky was filled with fragments of burning aluminum falling in trails of black smoke. The Hellcats' unmatched toughness made these shocking kills even easier. German pilots were used to flying machines that needed to avoid damage because even a handful of hits from heavy fire could doom them. But the Hellcat could eat punishment and keep moving, which meant American pilots could stay on an enemy longer, hold their firing angle longer, and deliver bursts with devastating accuracy. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds multiplied that lethality tenfold. Lieutenant Jim Thompson from Duluth proved this violently during the same battle. A Bf-109 had crept behind him, firing cannon shells that slammed into his rear fuselage, ripping holes across the tail. Any other fighter would have been torn apart or forced to bail out. But the Hellcat held together even though the elevators were damaged and the rudder shook under the force. Thompson managed a desperate barrel roll, something his wounded aircraft should not have been capable of, and as he came around, he brought his 6 guns in line with the attacking Bf-109. He fired a concentrated burst of armor, piercing incendiary rounds directly into the cockpit section. The first 2 rounds shattered the canopy, spraying shards of glass across the German pilot. The incendiary compounds ignited instantly, sending burning fragments through the cockpit space. 3 more rounds ripped directly into the instrument panel, and behind it destroying gauges, severing wiring and igniting hydraulic fluid, which burned hotter than anything the pilot had ever seen. A final round struck the pilot through the armor plate, behind him the burning metal, punching straight through his flight suit and flesh. The German pilot died screaming as his fighter tumbled downward, trailing a thick stream of oily smoke. The Brunswick fight cost the Luftwaffe 43 fighters destroyed, with 27 more damaged beyond repair. The Hellcats lost only 2 planes, and one of those surviving pilots became a prisoner of war. His aircraft had absorbed over 200 cannon shell hits before finally failing. The new ammunition changed the mathematics of aerial combat completely. Before the introduction of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, it typically took 360 conventional 50 caliber hits to bring down an enemy fighter. Now fewer than 40 explosive rounds could do the same job. A 2-second burst from 6 guns delivered enough destructive power to rip a machine apart instantly. Major Wilhelm Steinberg of JG-4 wrote in his diary that night that the Americans had always relied on quantity to win battles by overwhelming German skill. But now the Americans had quantity and an overwhelming qualitative advantage in their explosive bullets. He called it unfair, but admitted that war had never been fair. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Bobby Ray Jackson from Mississippi did not think about fairness or philosophy. He grew up hunting deer in the Delta woods, and shooting had always come naturally to him. To him, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds felt like a natural extension of that precision. One good hit to the right place could end any threat. His Hellcat carried 1,800 rounds, and he wasted none. He brought down 7 German fighters in 6 weeks over Europe. each kill recorded on gun camera footage that showed bright flashes erupting across the enemy aircraft moments before they fell apart. His most memorable kill happened on April 15, 1944, when he spotted a brand new Me-410 heavy fighter diving towards straggling bombers. The Me-410 was built to tear bombers apart, carrying cannons and machine guns in a sturdy twin-engine frame. But it was not built to outmaneuver a Hellcat. Jackson dove behind it and opened fire at 400 yards. His rounds struck the tail gunner, first turning the rear section into a storm of sparks and flame. Then they marched toward the fuselage fuel tank, where 3 impacts triggered a violent internal explosion, sending fire through the length of the aircraft. 5 more rounds tore into the port engine and killed it instantly. The starboard wing sheared off when rounds struck the main spar, leaving the aircraft spiraling in pieces. The engagement lasted 4 seconds. Jackson fired 96 rounds total. The Me-410 ceased to exist as a single aircraft, and the largest surviving part was the starboard engine found a quarter-mile from the crash site. Both crew members died instantly. The intelligence officers studying the wreckage argued at first that the aircraft had been hit by multiple cannon shells, but the holes were clearly .50 caliber sized. By May 1944, German pilots began avoiding Hellcats unless they outnumbered them heavily. Even then, they preferred quick diving attacks rather than dogfights. The psychological effect of the armor-piercing incendiary ammunition grew as deadly as the physical damage. Pilots were used to the fear of death, but they were not used to seeing aircraft light up with white-hot flashes every time a round struck. They were not used to seeing fighters lose wings or engines in seconds. Captain Erich Hartmann from Vienna, an ace with 23 victories, faced Hellcats on May 10, 1944. He led 6 Focke-Wulf 190s on a reconnaissance mission when they encountered 4 Hellcats protecting a photo aircraft. Normally, the numbers favored the Germans because speed and altitude could let them win or escape. But Hartmann had heard too many stories about explosive bullets turning aircraft into burning fragments. He ordered his men to maintain distance and avoid engagement, relying on speed to retreat if needed. But Lieutenant Commander Paul White from Seattle refused to let them go. He had been fighting since Pearl Harbor, and he believed that every German fighter allowed to escape was another danger to Allied bombers. He pushed his Hellcat into war emergency power and closed the distance slowly but surely. At 800 yards, he fired a ranging burst. The tracers fell short, but frightened Hartmann's inexperienced wingman, who panicked and broke left. White seized the moment. The Hellcat turning radius easily beat the 190, and White closed to 300 yards. He fired a 4-second burst, delivering 24 armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the German fighter. The rounds hit the tail first, blowing the rudder off. More rounds tore through the fuselage behind the cockpit, opening the metal like a can lid. Fire erupted instantly. The engine caught the next wave of rounds and exploded. The young Sergeant Friedrich Braun from Cologne bailed out, but his body was burned severely by the incendiary flames. He lived but spent 4 months in a hospital, and his testimony only deepened Luftwaffe fear. He said it felt like being struck by flak knot bullets because every hit exploded. Maintenance crews saw the difference as well. Master Sergeant Frank Collins from Chicago had patched battle, damaged American aircraft for 2 years, and he understood German damage patterns well. German cannon shells made thumb-sized holes and sometimes larger tears when they exploded inside structures. But the wrecked German fighters brought back now had round entry holes with massive exit craters surrounded by scorch marks. Collins examined one captured Bf-109 that had belly landed after taking 7 armor-piercing incendiary hits. The entry holes were small like any bullet, but the exits were enormous, surrounded by charred and peeled metal. The rounds had severed the main wing spar, wrecked the aileron linkage, and ignited fuel from a ruptured tank. 7 hits had caused more destruction than 50 conventional rounds would have. German engineers attempted fixes in late May 1944, adding armor plates and fire suppression systems, and revising tactics. But the change came too late. The Hellcats controlled the sky below 20,000 feet. The Germans held a performance edge higher, but most battles happened at bomber altitudes where the Hellcats thrived. On June 2, 1944, 4 days before D-Day, the Hellcats achieved their most significant victory in European skies. 2 Navy squadrons temporarily supporting invasion preparations intercepted a German sweep of 60 fighters over the Channel. 24 Hellcats armed entirely with armor-piercing incendiary rounds dove into the fight. Lieutenant David Anderson from Denver, who had once doubted the ammunition, now trusted it fully after seeing its results. His crew chief even painted small bombs on the ammunition bay doors as a light-hearted tribute to the explosive bullets. Anderson singled out the German leader, Major Hans Richter of Prussia. Richter turned toward him, but Anderson used a high-angle attack learned fighting Zeros and came down at a new angle. His rounds struck just behind the engine marching toward the cockpit, each impact flashing bright enough to be seen from miles away. One round hit the oxygen line, turning the small explosion into a roaring torch that filled the cockpit. Richter bailed out but died from burns before he reached the water. The sight of their leader consumed in seconds shattered German morale, and the formation fell apart instantly. The German pilots who survived the Channel battle carried home stories that spread through every squadron like wildfire stories of Hellcats firing bullets that erupted into white-hot flashes on impact stories of fighters tearing apart so quickly that the human mind could barely understand what had happened. One such survivor, Sergeant Otto Weber from Bavaria, later told interrogators that he saw 3 aircraft in his formation, destroyed in less than 30 seconds, each one lighting up with explosive impacts before disintegrating into fragments that rained toward the sea. Weber himself barely escaped when 4 armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the tail of his Focke-Wulf 190 and blew the entire assembly off the aircraft. His fighter tumbled violently, spinning so fast he could barely breathe, and he managed to bail out at only 2,000 feet. A British rescue boat recovered him an hour later, and he shakily described the American bullets as hellish weapons that tore fighters into funeral pieces. The battle ended with 18 German fighters destroyed and 11 more severely damaged, while the Hellcats lost 3 planes, but 2 of those pilots survived. The kill ratio stunned the Luftwaffe, and the psychological impact was even worse. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Hellcats flew dawn patrols above the invasion beaches, ready for any Luftwaffe interference, but German fighters were scarce because their numbers were depleted and their confidence shattered. When 12 Focke-Wulf 190s finally appeared over Sword Beach, 8 Hellcats intercepted them. The Germans took one look at the thick silhouettes of those flying tanks and fled, immediately diving for the deck and running east without firing a shot. Lieutenant Timothy Clark from Portland chased the trailing fighter along with 3 wingmen. They caught the fleeing German near Keene, and all 4 Hellcats fired at once, pouring over 200 armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the aircraft in 3 seconds. The German fighter did not crash in one piece. It scattered itself across the countryside in burning fragments. The largest recognizable piece was the engine, which had been torn free by explosive impacts. The pilot was never found and was presumed vaporized by the inferno inside the cockpit, as the incendiary compounds ignited with every hit. On the ground, Sergeant Salvatore Benedetto from Brooklyn kept count of ammunition and kill reports. Before the introduction of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, Hellcat squadrons averaged 400 rounds per kill. Afterward, the number dropped to 60. He had watched the difference firsthand during maintenance checks as he cleaned guns still warm from battle. He had seen the gun camera footage 2 fighters turning into showers of sparks whenever the new rounds struck. The Americans knew the ammunition was expensive, but they also knew it saved aircraft and pilots by ending fights in seconds rather than minutes. By July 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively conceded daylight airspace below 20,000 feet wherever Hellcats operated. Pilots still flew, but reluctantly, and they avoided the heavy American fighters whenever possible. The German pilot who had once laughed at the Hellcat now either lay in a grave or avoided combat entirely because that flying truck had become a flying destroyer. Lieutenant Hans Zimmermann from Dusseldorf survived 3 encounters with Hellcats, each time barely escaping, but his aircraft did not. Across 3 battles, he took 23 armor-piercing incendiary hits, and each fighter was written off because the bullets blew holes large enough to place a head through them. Fires continued burning after landing, and the metal looked shredded. Zimmermann developed a nervous twitch in his left eye whenever he heard engines overhead, and the squadron doctor called it combat fatigue, but Zimmermann knew it was fear of those explosive American rounds. Captain Michael Kowalski from Detroit, an ordnance officer, had doubted armor-piercing incendiary ammunition at first because the idea of an exploding machine gun bullet sounded like propaganda. But gun camera footage erased every doubt. He calculated that in a 1-second burst, a Hellcat delivering 40 explosive rounds could shear structural points, destroy engines, ignite fuel, or send burning fragments into the cockpit. No fighter in the world could endure all that. The truth was more dramatic than any photograph could show when Hellcats supported the invasion of southern France on August 15, 1944. 3 Navy carriers launched fighters to protect ground troops and supply lines, and the Luftwaffe scrambled 32 aircraft including Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. They clashed over the Rhone Valley, and the Hellcats once again demonstrated their terrifying power. Lieutenant Charles Murphy from Pittsburgh led the 1st Division into the fight. German pilots attempted vertical maneuvers to escape, but Murphy had mastered leading targets in the vertical plane. He fired into what appeared to be empty sky, but 2 seconds later, a Bf-109 flew directly into his stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The nose of the German aircraft vanished as the explosive impacts shredded the engine and ignited oil and fuel simultaneously. 4 rounds hit the cockpit, and the pilot died before Murphy released the trigger. The wings folded when their spars were severed, and the tail broke off from independent impacts. What had been a fighter seconds earlier became 2 clouds of burning wreckage drifting apart. 30 seconds later, Murphy's wingman ensign Robert Taylor from Houston achieved his first kill. A Focke-Wulf 190 attempted to dive away, but Taylor followed, and at 200 yards he fired a short burst. The rounds walked across the fuselage behind the cockpit, creating a line of explosive flashes that split the aircraft like a zipper. The 190 broke in half, with the front and tail sections falling separately. Intelligence summaries revealed that of the 14 German fighters shot down that day, only 3 pilots survived. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds were so devastating that many pilots died before they could attempt to escape, either incinerated or torn apart by the violent structural failures. On August 20, 1944, bombers attacked synthetic oil plants in Poland, the far edge of escort range. The Luftwaffe waited for the escorts to turn back, but 8 Hellcats fitted with extended drop tanks stayed with the bombers, and when 40 German fighters attacked, those 8 Hellcats stood alone between disaster and survival. Sergeant William Davis from Kansas City watched from the tail of his B-24 as the sky erupted with dazzling flashes. Every armor-piercing incendiary hit lit the enemy fighters like Christmas lights. He saw a Bf-109 take 50 hits and explode instantly, not burn, not spiral explode. The Hellcats broke the attack, destroying 11 fighters and damaging 6 more, while the bombers lost only 2 aircraft during the initial rush. German pilots bailed out, but Davis counted only 4 parachutes. The rest had died without understanding what hit them. Days later, Sergeant Franz Müller from Augsburg, flying top cover for Me-262 jets, learned the same lesson. The jets were Germany's hope, fast enough to outrun American fighters, but helpless during takeoff and landing. 4 Hellcats swooped down from 24,000 feet, and Müller turned into them, hoping to delay their attack. He fired cannon rounds into the lead Hellcat, damaging the wing, but the Hellcat endured it as if made of forged steel. Lieutenant Joseph Williams from Baltimore kept his guns on Mueller and fired a 4-second burst delivering 160 explosive rounds. The port wing shattered under the impact's aluminum skin, peeling away and spars breaking. More rounds struck the fuselage, carving holes the size of basketballs with scorching edges. The engine exploded when 18 cylinders disintegrated at once. Mueller tried to escape, but the canopy release jammed from explosive fragments. He struck the plexiglass trying to break it, but the aircraft began to spin violently and he could not free himself. The altimeter plunged through 5,000, 4,000, 3,000 feet. At 1,500 feet, the fighter hit the ground and Mueller became another statistic in the armor-piercing incendiary effectiveness reports. The Me-262s escaped that day, but the message was clear. Even Germany's most advanced technology could not operate near Hellcats because fighter protection had become impossible when every American burst delivered catastrophic explosive power. The sky had changed forever, and Germany had no answer left to give. By July 1944, the Luftwaffe had all but surrendered the daylight sky wherever Hellcats appeared because every German pilot who crossed paths with those American fighters spoke of the same nightmare, the bullets that exploded, the bullets that tore fighters open, the bullets that turned seconds into death. The German pilot who once laughed at the bulky Helk had no longer existed. Those who remained refused to underestimate the flying truck because it had become a flying executioner. Lieutenant Hans Zimmermann from Dusseldorf survived 3 separate encounters with Hellcats, though survival was a generous word, since each time his aircraft came back so devastated that mechanics declared it scrap metal. Across those battles, he absorbed 23 armor-piercing incendiary hits, and each hit left holes large enough to stick a head through. Fires burned deep inside the fuselage even after landing. Zimmermann, who had flown against British and American fighters for years, now twitched involuntarily whenever he heard aircraft engines. The squadron doctor labeled it exhaustion, but Zimmermann knew the truth. It was fear of those American bullets that acted like tiny bombs. Captain Michael Kowalski from Detroit, an ordnance officer, had initially believed armor-piercing, incendiary ammunition was exaggerated propaganda because the idea of explosive machine gun bullets sounded too strange to be real. But thousands of rounds later, after endless combat reports and gun camera footage, he accepted the truth. Each Hellcat firing all 6 guns at once delivered 40 explosive hits in a single second, and no aircraft on Earth could survive that. On August 15, 1944, when the invasion of southern France began, 3 Navy carriers launched Hellcats, loaded entirely with armor-piercing incendiary rounds to protect the advancing ground forces. The Luftwaffe mustered 32 fighters to resist, but they ran into 40 Hellcats soaring over the Rhone Valley. Lieutenant Charles Murphy from Pittsburgh led the 1st Division, and as the German pilots began vertical maneuvers, Murphy anticipated them perfectly because he understood how to lead targets climbing through the sky. He fired ahead of a Bf-109 that had just started a zoom climb, and 2 seconds later the German aircraft flew straight into a stream of explosive rounds. The nose of the fighter dissolved as the impacts shattered the engine and ignited the fuel. The cockpit absorbed 4 hits, and the pilot died instantly, becoming part of the flaming wreckage that fell below. The wings separated almost cleanly when armor-piercing incendiary rounds sheared both main spars. The tail dropped away. What once was a fighter became raining debris in the span of a heartbeat. Murphy's wingman ensign Robert Taylor from Houston achieved his first kill moments later. Focke-Wulf 190 tried to dive away, but Taylor boxed him in and waited until he was 200 yards behind before firing. His burst hit the fuselage behind the cockpit, and the explosive impacts ran in a neat line from one end to the other, splitting the aircraft open like a zipper. The fighter broke in half-dropping pieces across a wide field below. When intelligence reviewed the battle, they noted that out of 14 German fighters destroyed, only 3 pilots survived long enough to be taken prisoner. The rest were killed instantly by fire, structural collapse, or explosive fragmentation triggered by armor-piercing incendiary hits. Days later, Sergeant William Davis from Kansas City, serving as a gunner aboard a B-24, saw another display of the Hellcat's terrible power. His bomber group attacked synthetic oil plants in Poland, a mission at the extreme edge of escort range, and the Luftwaffe waited until the escort fighters turned back before launching 40 German fighters in a massive ambush. But 8 Hellcats fitted with extended drop tanks had stayed with the bombers, and now those 8 stood alone between life and death for the entire formation. Davis watched as the Hellcats dove into the German swarm, and the sky erupted in dazzling bursts of white light. Every armor-piercing incendiary impact looked like a flashbulb firing, and he saw a Bf-109 absorb a long stream of hits, maybe 50 impacts before it detonated in midair. Not caught fire later, but exploded instantly from cumulative damage. The Hellcats destroyed 11 fighters and disabled 6 more, forcing the Luftwaffe to break off. Only 2 bombers were lost, and only 4 German pilots managed to escape with parachutes. The rest died so quickly they never knew what hit them. In early September, Sergeant Franz Müller from Augsburg, a veteran with 38 missions and 6 victories, learned the same deadly lesson while escorting Me-262 jets during takeoff near Munich. The jets represented Germany's last hope capable of outrunning every Allied aircraft, but during takeoff they were helpless and American fighters began targeting them in these vulnerable moments. Müller and his wingmen tried to shield the jets when 4 Hellcats dove from 24,000 feet. Müller fired, first peppering the lead Hellcat with cannon shells that tore open a wing, but the Hellcat shrugged off the damage because its rugged frame could absorb punishment that would destroy any German fighter. Lieutenant Joseph Williams from Baltimore kept his guns fixed on Müller and fired a 4-second burst, delivering 160 explosive rounds. The port wing shattered instantly as armor-piercing incendiary rounds ripped through the aluminum skin, bending ribs and breaking spars. More rounds struck the fuselage, cutting open holes wide enough to see daylight through and leaving charred edges around each tier. The final cluster hit the engine, which exploded outward as cylinders and metal fragments flew in every direction. Müller attempted to escape, but the canopy release jammed because fragments had warped the frame. He struck the plexiglass, trying to break it, but centrifugal force pinned him in his seat as the fighter spun out of control. The altimeter unwound rapidly, passing 5,000, then 4,000, then 3,000 feet. At 1,500, the Focke-Wulf smashed into the earth, and Müller became another casualty logged into American ordnance reports. The Me-262s survived only because the Hellcats ended their attack after destroying Müller's escort formation. The message was clear. Even Germany's revolutionary jet fighters could not operate safely when their escorting fighters were helpless before the Hellcats' explosive ammunition. By late 1944, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds had become the defining factor in aerial combat. Every burst delivered destruction that no engineer in Germany could counter. Pilots who once bragged about their skill now avoided the skies below 20,000 feet. The Hellcat and its ammunition had become a force that reshaped the war, and every German pilot knew that to encounter those explosive bullets was to face death itself. By autumn of 1944, the truth settled into every German squadron like a suffocating fog. No fighter under the Luftwaffe flag could survive a clean burst from 6 American .50 caliber guns, loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. It no longer mattered how experienced the pilot was, or how aggressively he flew, because a single encounter with a Hellcat firing explosive ammunition could erase a fighter from the sky in the time it took to blink. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Johnson from Virginia understood this better than most. He had flown P-40 fighters in North Africa, then P-47s over Normandy, and finally he received Hellcats in August. And the moment he took one into combat, he realized he was flying something entirely different. The Hellcat was not elegant, not quick in the climb, and not suited for high-altitude duels, but it was brutally efficient. It could take hits like a battleship and deliver hits that no other fighter could match. Johnson described it as a flying war hammer that punished anything it touched. His squadron proved that description on October 12, 1944, during a massive sweep over the Ruhr Valley. They intercepted a mixed force of German fighters including Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and even older Bf-110 heavy fighters that had been pulled from training units because experienced pilots and modern aircraft had grown too scarce. The Germans had numbers on their side with more than 40 fighters in the air, while Johnson commanded only 16 Hellcats. Had he been flying P-47s, he might have stayed cautious, but with Hellcats and armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, he attacked immediately with full confidence. The merge erupted into a violent swirl of fighters. Johnson soon found himself sandwiched between two Bf-109s, both trying to trap him in a deadly crossfire. He climbed into a tight spiral, using the Hellcat's remarkable slow speed handling to maintain lift even as the stall horn wailed. At the top of the spiral, he hung almost weightless on his propeller, then snapped his nose downward onto the trailing Bf-109 and fired a razor-sharp burst. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds marched across the German fighter from spinner to tail in a line of bright flashes. The 109 disintegrated instantly. The tail sheared off, the wings folded, the engine burst into fragments. The pilot died before the aircraft finished breaking apart. The second Bf-109 tried to flee diving at maximum speed, but the Hellcat dove faster because of its raw weight and power. Johnson stayed behind him, closing to 100 yards, and fired a 1-second burst that delivered 40 explosive rounds into the size of a dinner plate. The fighter ceased to exist as a single object, transforming into a cloud of burning confetti in midair. When the battle ended, Johnson's squadron claimed 19 confirmed kills, 7 probables, and 11 damaged. They had fired around 24,000 rounds in total, which translated to roughly 1,200 rounds per kill, though the true number was much lower when counting only accurate hits. One Hellcat pilot recorded destroying a Focke-Wulf 190 using only 23 rounds, showing how efficient the ammunition became when the guns were lined up properly. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological effect grew worse than the physical losses. Veterans who had survived years of conflict now requested transfers to ground units because they no longer believed any amount of skill could save them. New pilots entered combat already defeated, having heard stories of fighters vanishing under white-hot flashes of explosive bullets. Among them was Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann from Heidelberg, who wrote a somber letter home on November 2, 1944. He had flown for 2 years, survived being shot down 3 times, and achieved 12 victories, yet he felt his courage thinning. He told his wife that dying in battle no longer frightened him, but the manner of death now terrified him. He wrote about the armor-piercing incendiary rounds that burned pilots alive or blew aircraft apart in the air, and about how no amount of talent, courage, or training could counter explosions triggered by hits as small as a fingertip. 2 days later, Hoffmann was dead. 4 Hellcats ambushed him as he attempted to attack a lone B-17, and his fuel tank erupted under a concentrated burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The inferno consumed him almost instantly. Intelligence officers who inspected the wreckage could not determine whether Hoffmann had died before or after impact. The evidence was too thoroughly destroyed. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was breaking apart. Germany still had pilots and aircraft, but they no longer had the will to challenge the Hellcats. When the Battle of the Bulge began on December 17th, the Luftwaffe launched nearly 1,000 sorties in support of their ground forces, hoping that overwhelming numbers might turn the tide. Instead, they encountered a lethal wall of American fighters, including 4 full squadrons of Hellcats. The results were catastrophic. The Hellcats shot down 39 German fighters while losing only 2 of their own, and one of those 2 pilots survived. Lieutenant Frank Peterson from Seattle achieved 4 kills in 6 minutes by firing only 320 rounds. Every burst he fired found something vital, and every German fighter struck by armor armor-piercing incendiary rounds disintegrated in spectacular fashion. The battles of Winter 1944 proved beyond any doubt that the Hellcat had become one of the deadliest fighters in the European theater, despite being designed originally for naval warfare in the Pacific. Captain James Mitchell from Atlanta flew his last combat mission on Christmas Eve 1944, escorting bombers toward Frankfurt. His squadron stumbled across what remained of JG-7, the Luftwaffe's first jet fighter unit, flying Me-262s. The jets were incredibly fast, capable of 540 miles per hour, but whenever they slowed to attack bombers, they became vulnerable. Mitchell caught a Me-262 just as it completed its firing run. Before the jet pilot could accelerate away, Mitchell opened fire with a 4-second burst, delivering 160 explosive rounds into the rapidly closing space between them. The Me-262 flew straight into a wall of detonating bullets. The port engine exploded violently. The cockpit section shattered under countless impacts. The pilot died instantly as armor-piercing incendiary rounds detonated inside the pressurized cabin. The starboard wing tore away in a cascade of sparks and fire. The tail section separated moments later. By the time the wreckage reached the outskirts of Frankfurt, it had broken into dozens of flaming pieces. The war still had 4 months to go, but by then the Luftwaffe no longer existed as a meaningful force. The Hellcats and their explosive ammunition had turned the sky into a domain that Germany could no longer contest. No fighter could dogfight the Hellcat. No fighter could outrun it in a dive. No fighter could survive a burst of its annihilating ammunition. Day by day, German resistance crumbled under the relentless pressure of explosive American firepower. The sky belonged to the Hellcat, and every pilot who flew it knew they were carrying a weapon combination that reshaped the war and ensured the end of the Luftwaffe's will to fight. By early 1945, the skies above Germany had become a silent graveyard where Luftwaffe fighters rarely dared to climb because every pilot who took off knew that somewhere above him a Hellcat might be waiting with 6 guns loaded entirely with armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could erase an aircraft in a single burst. Lieutenant Robert Brown from Phoenix learned this as he led 12 Hellcats on a fighter sweep over Munich on January 14, 1945. They expected resistance, but not a single German fighter rose to meet them. When Brown looked down, he saw airfields full of silent aircraft lined neatly in rows, as if waiting for a funeral procession. Not one engine turned over. Not one pilot stepped forward to fly. The Luftwaffe was broken. Brown led his squadron into a strafing run, and the armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through parked aircraft with terrifying ease. Each hit erupted into a flash brighter than sunlight, igniting fuel stores and ammunition bins, as if the airfield itself were built from explosives. The Germans on the ground could only watch as years of work, maintenance and sacrifice burned away in minutes. A mechanic interviewed after the war said that watching Hellcats strafe with armor-piercing incendiary rounds felt like witnessing a thunderstorm created by the devil himself, because every bullet struck like lightning and every impact set off a chain of destruction too violent to comprehend. In 10 minutes, the Americans destroyed aircraft that Germany no longer had the means or pilots to replace. As winter deepened, the Luftwaffe sank into silence. Many bases still had aircraft, but few had the will to fly them. By March 1945, Hellcat patrols searched the sky and found nothing. The elite German squadrons that once boasted dozens of aces now sheltered their remaining aircraft under trees or inside barns, hoping to hide them from the relentless American fighters. Lieutenant David Anderson from Columbus flew his final mission on April 20, 1945, sweeping across southern Germany with a full squadron of Hellcats. They saw the ruins of former airfields and the skeletal remains of burned hangars. They found wrecked German fighters pushed to the edges of runways, as if Germany itself had grown tired of burying its dead. Not one German fighter rose to meet them. Anderson, who had first flown Hellcats in January 1944, still remembered when German pilots mocked the Hellcat for its shape and size. A year later, he had 22 confirmed kills, all achieved with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. He had fired 54 rounds per kill on average, and every German aircraft he struck had disintegrated under the explosive power of his guns. When Victory in Europe Day arrived on May 8, 1945, Hellcat squadrons looked back on a staggering combat record. More than 400 German aircraft had been destroyed, while fewer than 40 Hellcats were lost. The average ammunition expenditure per kill had fallen from over 400 rounds to fewer than 100 thanks entirely to the armor-piercing incendiary rounds that made every hit catastrophic. Yet, statistics told only a fraction of the story because the psychological effect of explosive ammunition had become a weapon of its own. German pilots who once faced death with pride now returned to their bases trembling after encounters with Hellcats. Many refused to fly again, some surrendered without firing a shot. The Hellcat had become a creature of terror in the minds of its enemies. Years later, at veterans' reunions, former Luftwaffe pilots spoke about this fear openly. Hans Miller, a German pilot who survived being shot down by a Hellcat firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, told American Master Sergeant Tom Williams that the ammunition was the most terrifying weapon he had ever faced. Not because it killed him, but because it killed without warning, without mercy, and without giving a pilot any chance to escape. He said the armor-piercing incendiary rounds felt like being hit by flak and fire at the same time. Navy pilots who had never flown in Europe heard these stories and carried them into post, or training as legend. The Hellcat became known not just as a rugged workhorse, but as a destroyer of men and machines because its bullets exploded on impact, and each impact carved a fighter apart like a surgeon using fire instead of steel. Colonel Robert Johnson, who had commanded Hellcat squadrons in Europe, later wrote that the armor-piercing incendiary ammunition was the single greatest leap in fighter armament during the entire war. He believed that radar advances or new engine designs or improved gun sights all mattered, but nothing changed air comm. At more than giving every pilot the ability to fire exploding bullets at 800 rounds per minute per gun. Historians would later agree because the ammunition combined 3 destructive forces in one. The incendiary compound ignited instantly with temperatures reaching thousands of degrees. The explosive effect blasted open structural points far beyond the size of a normal bullet hole. The hardened steel core punched deep into the frame, ripping through armor and internal components. Together, they produced a level of destruction that no fighter of any nation could sustain. Lieutenant William Davis from San Antonio flew Hellcats with both conventional and armor-piercing incendiary rounds, and he compared the difference to replacing a hammer with a cutting torch. Conventional bullets beat an aircraft into submission, requiring hundreds of hits to ensure a kill. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds dismantled it with precision because every impact targeted structure, fuel, and flesh at the same time. He recalled one battle where he shot down a Bf-109 using only 17 rounds. The cost of manufacturing the new ammunition was high because each round required a specialized chemical mixture and hardened penetrator core. But American industry absorbed the expense without hesitation because one Hellcat armed with explosive rounds was worth 3 armed with ordinary ammunition. The Navy estimated that armor-piercing incendiary rounds saved more than 200 bombers by destroying attackers faster than they could form coordinated strikes. The Luftwaffe had attempted to copy the ammunition, but their factories lacked the chemical resources and precision tooling required to mass produce it. German cannon rounds remained lethal, but cannon fired more slowly held fewer rounds and lacked the overwhelming volume of fire that 650 caliber guns could unleash. This difference in philosophy turned the Hellcat into a symbol of American industrial warfare. It was not the fastest fighter, nor the prettiest, nor the most advanced, but it was the toughest and carried the most destructive ammunition of the war. German pilots stopped laughing at the Hellcat once they learned what those bullets could do. By the final winter of the conflict, they ran from it. By spring, they hid from it. And by the war's end, the very silhouette of a Hellcat in the sky was enough to make entire formations break apart in fear. The flying truck with exploding bullets had become the hammer that shattered the Luftwaffe for good. In the final months of the war, the Hellcat and its armor-piercing incendiary rounds stood unmatched in the skies because nothing the Luftwaffe possessed could challenge a fighter that fired bullets which exploded on impact, bullets that tore wings from roots, bullets that carved open cockpits, and ignited fuel with terrifying speed. After Germany surrendered, many believed the Hellcat would fade quietly into history, but its legacy only grew because pilots and historians alike recognized that its brief service in Europe from early 1944 to the war's end had reshaped air combat forever. In the Pacific, the Hellcat already held a reputation as a zero killer, but in Europe, where German fighters were tougher, faster, and often flown by seasoned veterans, the explosive ammunition revealed its full potential. It turned a rugged naval fighter into a weapon feared across the continent. Years after the conflict, aviation scholars debated whether any other Allied fighter achieved a higher kill-to-loss ratio in European service. The Mustang and Thunderbolt were more famous and flew in far greater numbers, but pound for pound, bullet for bullet, the Hellcat may have been the deadliest American fighter to ever cross the skies above Germany. The reason was simple. German aircraft were built with armor and self-sealing tanks that resisted ordinary machine gun fire, but they could not resist bullets that detonated on impact and burned at thousands of degrees while a hardened core punched through metal that once felt secure. Time and time again, German pilots described the horror of seeing a single burst of fire from a Hellcat erupt into dozens of bright flashes, each one marking a detonation that tore metal apart like paper. At a reunion in Munich in 1975, former Luftwaffe pilots, many now old and grey, still spoke of Hellcats with unease. They remembered how American flying trucks had climbed into their airspace with 6 guns blazing explosive rounds that turned fighters into falling scrap. They remembered how a few seconds of exposure to armor-piercing incendiary hits could end a pilot's career or his life before he knew he was in danger. One veteran, Major Erich Schultz, told the gathering that the Hellcat represented the one thing German pilots feared more than any enemy, and that was American industry. He said that Germany had fought with courage and skill, but the United States fought with factories that could build aircraft by the thousands and ammunition by the millions, and that the armor-piercing incendiary round symbolized this overwhelming power. Schultz explained that to the Germans it felt as if every American bullet had been crafted by a machine that understood exactly how to kill a fighter as fast as possible. In 2003, Admiral James Patterson, the last surviving Hellcat pilot who had flown combat missions in Europe, gave his final interview. When asked about the armor-piercing incendiary rounds, he smiled and said that firing them almost felt like cheating because each trigger pull carried such devastating power. He said that the rounds saved his life many times over, saved his wingmen, and saved countless bomber crews by ending fights before the enemy could return fire. Every time he saw a German fighter come apart in a storm of white-hot flashes, he remembered that those bullets meant more Americans would return home. After the war, the Hellcat retired from frontline service in 1954, replaced by jet fighters that flew faster and reached higher altitudes, but the lessons of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition endured. Modern fighter cannons fire explosive rounds as standard practice because militaries learned that it made no sense to fire bullets that only punched holes when they could fire bullets that blew targets apart instantly. Engineers refined the technology, but the core principle remained unchanged. Every modern round is a descendant of the ammunition that once armed the Hellcat. When people watch restored Hellcats at air shows today, they see polished engines and graceful loops through the sky. They admire the thundering roar of the Pratt and Whitney engine and the broad wings that once launched from carriers into war. Few in the crowd imagine what those wings once carried, or how those guns once filled the sky with fire hot enough to melt aluminum in seconds. They see symbols of victory, of American strength, and of a generation that refused to yield. They do not imagine the German pilots who watched their fighters burst apart in midair. They do not think about cockpit fires that erupted instantly, or wings that tore free, or engines that exploded under the combined force of heat and pressure. Perhaps it is better that they do not remember, because war is always ugly, and the armor-piercing incendiary rounds made it uglier still. Yet, for all the destruction, the ammunition caused many historians argue that it helped end the conflict more quickly. It broke the Luftwaffe's ability to resist. It shattered their confidence and stripped them of their last hope that skill or bravery alone could turn the tide. The Hellcat with its explosive rounds represented warfare at its most practical. Build a machine strong enough to absorb punishment, arm it with ammunition that guarantees destruction, train pilots to deliver accurate bursts. Then let overwhelming efficiency decide the outcome. In the end, the German pilots who once mocked the Hellcat learned the harshest truth of war. It does not matter how graceful a fighter looks or how perfectly it rolls or climbs. What matters is what happens when the guns fire. And when the Hellcat fired with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, every burst became a storm of miniature explosions that could erase an aircraft in seconds. The flying truck with exploding bullets ruled the skies for a brief but decisive moment in history. The laughter that once greeted its appearance died, quickly replaced by fear and respect. And by the time the war ended, no one laughed at all. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.